Cory Doctorow is a technology activist who spent years criticizing the way digital systems are built and sold and eventually turned against the people who use them. He came up with the term enshittification to describe how platforms start by serving users, then shift to serving businesses, and finally just serve themselves. In his latest book, Doctorow is making the case that there's nothing inevitable in the trajectory of artificial intelligence. He says the technology can be useful, of course, but right now it's so entangled in hype that it's hard to see clearly how it's actually going to change the world. He says we're in an AI boom right now, and it's being driven not just by the technology itself, but by the financial story built around it. He says tech companies are making a case not to users, but to investors. And the story they're selling is that these systems will eventually replace high-cost human labor at mass scale. It's a hype cycle. And when the bubble bursts, he thinks it will burst, what will be left won't be revolution or collapse. It will be something more mundane. AI used for smaller stuff like transcriptions and image processing and everyday tools. So useful, but not transformational. It's not going to completely reorganize society. And Doctorow is not just interested in what AI does, but who it does it to, who's in control. And he begins his book with a story that illustrates this.
You may remember that for a minute or two there, the main character on the internet was a guy called Marco Buscaglia. He was a freelance writer, and he had written a summer guide that was syndicated by Hearst to a ton of newspapers around America. It had a bunch of lists of things to do, books to read, movies to see, beaches to go to, and the vast majority of these had his byline. And what kicked off the main characterdom for this poor, unfortunate fella was that his summer reading guide was full of books that didn't exist. They were by real writers, but those writers had never written those books. So all of these writers were like, why are you recommending a book that doesn't exist? Well, they were like that for 1 second. And then in the second they said, why did you let an AI make up some books? He got a lot of heat. And maybe the best person to write about him was another reporter, one who tracked him down and spoke to him himself, a guy called Jason Kebler. He cut his teeth at the Washington Monthly, where he wrote these guides. And he was like, when I was an intern writing guides for the Washington Monthly, 3 of us would research one of these lists. And then we turn it over to an experienced editor who would then turn it over to our fact checkers, who would go through it with a fine-tooth comb. And it's pretty clear that none of that happened. And when you talk to Buscaglia, it's clear that none of that happened. Buscaglia was really chagrined about this because he'd been caught effectively cheating, and he felt terrible about it. But Jason's take on this was like, how on earth did Hearst Syndicate, a massive international media organization, how did they ask one guy to write the majority of a 64-page guide? I mean, they must have known that this guy would end up using AI. You can't not. It's like asking someone to get from here to a store that's 10 miles away in 10 minutes. They're not going to walk, right? They're going to drive or take a cab. And you can't really act surprised when they show up at the other end and they go like, well, I didn't walk. And they're like, well, it was a walking thing. So when I read that, I was really struck because I had just had my own experience using AI. I'm also a freelance writer. And I used AI not because anyone made me use it, but because I was writing an article. And I needed to source a quote that I'd heard on a podcast, and I couldn't remember where. I looked and I dug and I scrolled through the audio of the podcast I'd heard recently, and I just could not find it. So I went and I found an open weight, open source model from OpenAI called Whisper. And I took the last 30 hours of audio that I played in my podcast app, and I dropped them into Whisper's inbox, and then I ran the little command that had Whisper turn them into text. And my little laptop, which doesn't have a GPU, whose fan didn't even turn on, had turned all of this audio into text. I found the exact quote, It came with time code. I pulled it up, I listened to it, I made sure the transcription was great, and I put it in my post. And this got me to thinking, there's just a really big difference between automation that your boss makes you use and automation that you as a worker use because you think it's going to make your life better.
The difference is you used AI to transcribe some audio to be useful in these certain ways. Buscaglia used it to generate some writing. That's the important distinction, right?
I don't think that it's the generating the words that matters. It's why he generated the words. The reason he generated the words is that his boss demanded that he do something that exceeded the capacity of a human and insisted that he use an automation tool to do it. When your boss is in charge of automation, what they want is quantity. Even if the stuff that comes out the other end isn't as good, they want you to work as fast as you can. But when workers adopt automation, well, look, workers can make mistakes, but the reason a worker adopts automation is generally to make the thing better. It's because they're trying to make something great, and the automation tells them how to do it. Whether that's like using a blender to whip cream instead of hitting it with a fork for 40 minutes until your wrist falls off. It's not that you're using it, it's who's making you use it. It's why you're using it. It's the social arrangement of the gadget. Not what the gadget does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. And, the AI industry would really like us to spend all of our time arguing about what the AI can and can't do, whether it's going to wake up and become God and turn us into paper clips or whatever. But they really don't want us to talk about who it's doing it for and who it's doing it to.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Cory Doctorow's new book is called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. Here in Utah, the debate over AI has been playing out in a very particular way. The proposed data center development in Box Elder County has become this flashpoint with these big questions about water and power, but it's also created a strange kind of political consensus. It's brought together people who don't usually agree on much of anything, who share this sense of unease about AI. And that's where we began our conversation with Cory Doctorow.
I think that there is a connection, but you can't start the story in Utah. I think you have to set some context first for how AI came upon us before you can really make sense of as you say, this very heartening coalition of people who are normally politically at odds with one another, who seem to have found common cause in hating this data center and maybe being suspicious of AI.
Yeah.
So AI is not the first tech bubble that I've lived through, and it's not the first tech bubble that anyone who's been paying attention has encountered. We're actually at the end of a string of tech bubbles that came along with incredible regularity. It was the metaverse and Web3 and cryptocurrency and so on. But it is a much larger tech bubble than any tech bubble that we've ever lived in. So, to give you a little comparison here, Mark Zuckerberg wasted $60 billion of his investors' money on the metaverse before basically shutting that project down. In the last 3 years, he spent $150 billion on AI, and he says he's going to spend that much again just this year, and he's thinking about spending even more next year. So this is a much larger bubble than any of the bubbles that we've lived through. So we kind of need to ask, where did the bubble come from? Why do we have bubbles at all? But also, why is this bubble so big? And I think the answer is a mix of material and psychological factors. So materially, companies that have saturated their markets really run a risk that their investors are going to decide that they're not going to grow anymore. When Google has a 90% search market share, it's very implausible that that company is going to grow. And the problem with, being the CEO of a company that stopped growing is that it means that your stock is now wildly overvalued, because you can think of stock as like a claim on the future earnings of a company. Well, if a company is growing, then those future earnings might be very large compared to today's earnings. But if the company is static, then next year's earnings will be the same as this year's and the year after and the year after. Maybe it'll grow or shrink a little, but it's what we call a mature company. Yeah. And we calculate its price to earnings ratio, like how much the company is worth based on how much it's making, much more conservatively than we think about the price to earnings ratio of a growing company. And when you're a growing company and you have one of these vast price to earnings ratios, like say Tesla, your stock is highly liquid. It's basically as good as cash, which means that if you want to grow by buying another company or by hiring people, you can just offer them stock. Yeah. You don't have to give them dollars. And the cool thing about stock is that you make it on the premises by typing zeros into a spreadsheet, unlike cash, which you only get from like a banker or an investor or a customer. And if you try to make the cash on the premises, the Treasury Department shows up and arrests you. So, when you're highly liquid and you're growing, you can keep growing by buying other companies. But when you stop, well, that's a huge risk for you. And also, if you're the CEO or an executive at one of these companies, your employment, your salary was mostly in stock. So your net worth stands to plummet if the company is no longer perceived as growing. So these companies, they're always in search of a growth story. Yeah. And there was a time when that story was, well, sure, we're Google, but we're about to become Facebook because we have this new product called Google+. Or, hey, we're Facebook, but we're about to become YouTube because we did the pivot to video. Yeah. And the cool thing about that is we know how much Facebook is worth because it's on their balance sheet. The hard thing about that is that Facebook has definite ideas about why Google isn't about to become Facebook. And you have a ugly argument in public. Whereas if you claim you're going to conquer an imaginary market, sure, no one can tell you how big that is, but no one can tell you how small it is. And so long as you've got a new growth story, once the old one peters out, assuming it does, maybe it'll work eventually, you can just keep running across the river on the backs of alligators. You might never lose a leg. So that's why we have the AI bubble.
Well, let me make sure I'm following. Yeah. So basically an AI company needs enormous returns, and so they need to create a story that's big enough to justify this humongous valuation. And the big story here is, at least I think this is the case you're making in the book, AI, this is the story. AI is going to replace expensive human labor.
Yeah. That's the psychological part, right?
Okay.
What is it that makes AI so attractive that makes investors willing to spend? Well, when I wrote the book and turned it in last year, the spend on AI globally was about $700 billion. It's doubled. It's now $1.4 trillion. So, yeah, the question is like, what makes them so willing to spend all this money? And I think it's because the market, management, capital, your boss, is really interested in not paying you. And historically, it has always been easy to sell a way to fire workers and replace them with machines. Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, obviously there's the wages, but also I think if you're the boss, you know that if you don't come into work for a day, the shop is just going to keep running. But if none of the workers show up to the shop, well, that's the end of the business. And so while you're supposed to be driving the car, there's a part of you that suspects that maybe you're strapped in the back seat with a Fisher-Price steering wheel. And what AI offers is the ability to wire the toy steering wheel into the car's drivetrain. So you as the boss come up with some amazing idea for a product, and you don't ever have to ask someone who knows how to do things to make that product happen. You just type it into an AI, make me $1 billion business, make no mistakes, and out comes the product, the service. And you don't have one of these like ego-shattering confrontations with people who explain to you that you're just kind of dumb because you don't really understand how the business you're nominally in charge of works and why your idea won't work. And I think that's a very seductive idea. So on the one hand, they're saying, yeah, we're going to replace, well, it's at this point, if you're going to look at a return on $1.4 trillion, it's going to have to be tens of trillions of dollars worth of labor. And on the other hand, there is a lot of easy marks out there for a story about kind of a world of work without workers, a world without people. And it's not unique to bosses. I mean, you look at the AI boyfriend, AI girlfriend, pitch. It's basically romance without romantic partners. And Mark Zuckerberg, what does he want? He wants social media without socializing. He's like, well, your friends, sure, they're the reason you stay on the platform, but I've tried and tried, and I can't get your friends to organize their social relations with you to maximize your engagement with my advertisements, which means that your friends are defective. So I'm going to replace them with chatbots, and we'll have a social media network that has no socializing on it, right? It's a profoundly solipsistic idea, a world without people.
What happens when workers keep repeating the narrative about AI replacing their job? It seems like what you're saying is that they're possibly unintentionally strengthening the case for replacing themselves in some way.
Yeah. Well, look, bubbles are really bad. I didn't say that part, but that part's really true and very important. Bubbles are really, really bad because bubbles are a way of transferring money from the pockets of sort of everyday savers to insiders, on the basis of a lie. Because bubbles are, they're irrational exuberance. They're about the story that you can make more money than you actually will. That's what makes it a bubble instead of just an investment. And we live in a world where about 45 years ago, we decided that instead of your employer giving you a pension when you get old until you die, that you would have to invest money in the stock market. And if you guessed wrong, you'd be homeless and starve when you got old. And so people are looking for ways to not be homeless and starve. And bubbles are a way to do that. And so we need to burst this bubble. And we need to burst it also because even if AI can't do your job, an AI salesman finds it remarkably easy to convince your boss to fire you and replace you with an AI that can't do your job because, as I said, bosses are easy marks for stories about getting rid of people. And so when you go out there and you say the AI can do my job and what are we going to do about it? I'm really scared about this. You are helping the AI salesman sell AI to your boss. Just like the people who say that, what Facebook does with its ads is not like exploit a monopoly that lets them missell products that don't perform as well as they claim they are. But instead, people go around and they go like, my grampy became a QAnon because Facebook hacked his dopamine loops because they built a mind control ray.
Yeah.
And what you do is you help, Mark Zuckerberg's salespeople go out on their sales calls and say like, why should you pay a 40% premium to advertise on Facebook? Well, if you ask my enemies, they'll tell you, I am Cyber Rasputin, and I have perfected the mind control that evaded MK Ultra and Mesmer and pickup artists and so on using big data. And I can sell anything to anyone. And you had better start advertising on my platform, or you're going to be left behind. And you better pay me a high premium to do it. So let's not help them raise capital for this destructive bubble that is, putting workers who do useful things on the breadline and replacing them with chatbots that are bad at doing those things. And then those chatbots are quite likely going to go offline when some or I think maybe all of these companies run out of money and have to shut down their servers, at which point we'll have no one to do those jobs. This is why I say that AI is the asbestos we're shoveling into the walls of our high-tech society and that our descendants will be digging it out for generations.
Cory Doctorow. His new book is called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI, How to Think About Artificial Intelligence Before It's Too Late. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're talking with the science fiction writer and technology activist Cory Doctorow. In his new book, Doctorow is questioning this idea that artificial intelligence follows an inevitable path. He says what we're seeing right now isn't just technological change. It's also a financial story that's being constructed for investors, and it's built around this promise of replacing human labor at scale. It's a bubble, he says, and when it bursts, what's left won't be a revolution, it'll be something more mundane, something useful, but not necessarily transformational. The book is called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. Talk a little bit more about how you are working through this as a science fiction writer. You say in the book science fiction is an anti-inevitabilist literature. And that it's only incidentally about thinking up new gadgets and explaining what they do. It seems like what you're also doing is laying out the idea that these are choices.
They're social choices. as well as individual choices, actually much more so social choices than individual choices. And this is where my work as a science fiction writer and my work as an activist come together, because as an activist, you know, I've been at it for 25 years. I work for a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I think they're the most effective and most important digital rights group in the world. And over 25 years, I have watched time and again as we have enacted policies that had both the foreseeable and foreseen outcome of producing all kinds of harm. And then I've watched in absolute fury as the people who made these decisions were like, well, how could we have predicted this? And even worse, where the rest of us kind of forgot that we warned them about it. It's like we have so little object permanence that we could lose a game of peekaboo. And so because I know that these were choices, because I know that we made decisions to allow certain behavior and to prohibit others, and that this was the likely outcome, I am able to understand that we could have had something different, and that's where the science fiction comes in. You know, Margaret Thatcher, her nickname was Tina because her favorite saying was, "There is no alternative." Yeah. As in, there's only one way we can organize our society, and it's the way that is throwing people out of work and dismantling our social safety net and making your boss richer while you get poorer. And this is not an ideological question. This is an empirical one. There is no alternative, by which she meant stop trying to think of alternatives. And that's the thing I find grossly offensive. As a science fiction writer, I think of 6 alternatives every morning before breakfast. Right. And so I look at AI and I'm like, it would be very weird to be opposed to statistical inference. There's nothing wrong with the idea of advanced statistical inference techniques. Yeah. But the idea that the only way we can do this is by raising literally trillions of dollars and using up all of the energy and water left on the planet Earth and busting through all of our carbon limitations and unjustly firing workers and replacing them with bad chatbots that then have the effect of making them miserable and us miserable because we relied on the things those workers made, and now it's being done badly by chatbots. And that we have to have and now we're getting to Utah, that we have to have these data centers, and that the data centers are so horrible to be near. And the stated purpose of the data center, you know, which is to replace skilled workers with bad chatbots, is so odious that the only way we can do it is to dispense with all democratic formalities and just cram it down people's throats. Right? That's not inevitable. No one came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets, or, you know, this is Utah. No one buried 2 tablets in a backyard in upstate New York that had this written on it. It was a set of choices that we made. And because I have enough object permanence that I can win a game of peekaboo, I remember that we made those choices like last week, and I refuse to accept that there is no alternative.
Let's come back to the story that we started with, the difference in the experience of using AI between Boscalia and you. The distinction is between a centaur and a reverse centaur. This is important to talk about because this is it's kind of the analogy you've come up to help us sort of understand all of this. So take us through this idea, if you would.
Yeah, in automation theory, a centaur is someone assisted by a machine. So whether you're like using a megaphone on a picket line or riding a bicycle or using a spell checker or, again, using a blender instead of a whisk to make whipped cream, you are a centaur. You are a human head that is doing the thinking, the planning, and the direction for a tireless machine body that goes where you point it. I know this isn't exactly what horses do, but
you provide the prompt.
It's an analogy.
Yeah.
You don't just provide the prompt; you provide the reason for the prompt.
Right.
You choose to prompt, and you choose why you're prompting, when you're prompting, and when you're not prompting. What you use the tool for. And a reverse centaur is the opposite. A reverse centaur is a human who is conscripted to serve as a peripheral for a machine that can do some of the job, but not all of it. And that needs a human to deliver some piece of it. So, we've seen that I Love Lucy classic scene where Lucy and Ethel are working on the assembly line, and they're putting chocolates in boxes, and the assembly line goes faster and faster, and they have to work faster and faster, and eventually it's a disaster. And the reason the assembly line is going faster and faster, again, is because if you invest in an assembly line, right, you build the asset, it starts depreciating the minute, the technicians walk out of the factory, and you want to get as much value out of it as you can, and the human is the bottleneck. And so you want to run that human at the absolute limit of human endurance and capability. So you don't just use the human, you use them up. And so we find that the most automated workplaces are often the ones that are most injurious to workers. Amazon has built the world's most advanced automated warehouses, and they have 3 times the national average of warehouse-related worker injuries. And those aren't coincidences. They're closely connected, because when you make a 7 or 8 figure investment in automation, you want to use the machines as much as possible. And so you make the workers work as fast as they can, and when they work that fast, they hurt themselves. It's also why we don't give them pee breaks. It's also why, you have all those other problems that are associated with working for Jeff Bezos. And so, that reverse centaur situation, it's not a nice one to be in. Think again of Bezos, right? He's got these vans that deliver our packages. And the drivers in those vans are there because the van can't get the package to your apartment or ring your doorbell or stick in your mailbox or do any of the other things needed to get the parcel to you. So even if we perfect a self-driving van, which I think is a ways off, but even if we did, it would still need the same number of humans in the van. It would need the worker who does it. And so they are really a peripheral for the van. And that worker is disciplined to operate with maximum efficiency from the perspective of the van. So they are watched by many, many cameras. It's between 9 and 20 depending on the van. There are cameras on the outside, cameras on the inside, cameras that are looking to see if you're driving with your mouth open, because that's singing, and singing is distracted driving, and so you lose wages if you do it. They are being given a quota and a route to run, and they're not allowed to divert from that route. They're not even supposed to swerve. And there's an ethnography published recently by Katie Wells of these drivers that includes the story of a driver who was driving his Amazon van, and a big rig came at him because it had drifted across the median because the driver had fallen asleep. And he swerved to avoid a head-on collision and lost his job because of a sudden maneuver. So, the machine is just picking the drivers who will drive predictably and do the things that are going to smoothly deliver maximum return on that asset. And you as the human, even though technically you're working the steering wheel and the brakes, you're really being driven by the machine and not the other way around.
I think there's a really interesting section in the book where you talk about art, AI art. And I wanted to ask you about one of the questions you ask is whether AI art is good. And you sort of work through the idea by talking about what art is, whether art is good or – would you spend some time talking about how you were thinking about this?
So I think we need to distinguish between things that are beautiful or striking and things that are art.
Yeah.
So, if you're an atheist, when you see a sunset, you don't think the sunset is trying to tell you anything, right? It has nothing to say to you. It might be very beautiful. It might be very striking. But it has nothing to say. The sun is not setting in order to please itself or you. It is just following the unavoidable laws of physics. But if you paint that sunset, or even photograph that sunset, or describe that sunset, you do so to try and evince an emotion from someone else. And look, there are long debates within art about whether the intent of the artist matters, whether the intent of the audience member matters, and so on and so on and so on. And I will stipulate that you can have an artistic reaction to something even if you misunderstand or don't understand the intent of the artist. But that the thing that makes it art is that someone made it to try and make you feel something. That's what distinguishes art from beautiful things. And AI doesn't want you to feel anything. AI has nothing it feels that it wants to transmit to you.
Yeah.
If art is the process of taking some irreducible, numinous feeling and trying to infuse it into some intermediary, like a painting or a photo or a book or a dance or any other artistic expression, in the hopes that a facsimile of that feeling will materialize in the mind and breast of the person who sees it, well, then AI doesn't have any of that. And you might have that, right? You're prompting the AI. Mm-hmm. But when you write 3 sentences, describe me a sunset, make it beautiful, make no mistakes, and you prompt the AI, your intention is so diffused, right? It's so diluted, those 3 sentences across 1 million pixels, that they add up to nothing, right? You take any section of the image, and the amount of communicative intent that can be discerned in it, no matter how hard you look and how long you stare at it, the amount of communicative intent is homeopathic. It rounds to 0. And so, people who believe in animism or God, they can look at a sunset and they can infer an intent. And I'll put my cards on the table here. I don't believe in those things. So what I think those people are doing is they're talking to themselves, which, good. Know thyself. They put it on Greek temples for a reason.
Right.
But you're not having an artistic interaction, or at least if you are, the artistic interaction is with you, right? You are hallucinating, right? It's not the AI that's hallucinating. It's you that's hallucinating the art in that work. And, if there was some kind of extremely weird natural phenomenon that when you stood in a certain spot and threw a pile of leaves in the air, they fell down and spelled out sentences, we would be amazed by that for a while. And then we'd notice that the sentences had nothing to say. Yeah. And then when people sent us pictures of the nonsense sentences the leaves made, we'd go like, yeah, we know about the leaves. Like they are not striking anymore. They're not beautiful anymore. They have regressed to the mean. And maybe if you stood there and you threw the leaves in the air long enough and looked at all the sentences, just like the Dadaists with their cut-up poetry, and then picked out the ones that were interesting and combined them in ways that expressed your communicative intent, maybe that would be art. But the thing that happens when in computer science we call it stochastic, the stochastic process that produces the word salad or the one pixel after another in the image or the moving image, the thing that produces that just has nothing to say, and the person who prompts it has not said enough that it matters. And so what you end up with is something that is at best striking or very possibly beautiful, but is not art.
But you also say that you won't rule out the possibility that in 10 years you're going to look back at this and say, I can't believe I used to think that AI prompts couldn't yield good art.
Yeah, so if you've got someone out there who prompts an AI over and over again and reprompts it and makes changes and feeds those changes back in, you get some words out and you retype them and you say, this is kind of what I want these words to read like, not like that. And you keep going around and around and around. Basically, if you do as much work, well, then maybe you'll get something out that's art. One of the best birthday weekends I ever had, my wife checked us into this old hotel in London. We used to live in London. It was one of the oldest, maybe it was the oldest hotel in London. And in the lobby, they had these gazetteers, these annuals of Punch, which was this old satirical magazine. Yeah. And it was full of these short news items. And we had breakfast in bed, and I went down to the lobby and grabbed one and just thumbed through it. And I'll never forget, one of them was, an American gentleman has invented a type writing machine that will allow you to put down the words faster than you can think of them. No more will we have to suffer the indignity of bad tavern nibs. And it was just, you can imagine lying in bed all morning and doing this. It was very fun. But also, there was a time when, the way people wrote incorporated a certain amount of introspection that was engendered by the speed at which the words could emerge from their pen.
Yeah. Right?
And we had to learn different ways to do exactly as much work. Right? I don't think we do less work when we type. Right? I type all my novels. I've written more than 30 books. I type them. I have terrible handwriting. I don't think I do less work than when I write. I just do different work. And so maybe we will prompt AIs with so much ardor that it will create so much communicative freight in what emerges from it that it will be discernible and moving to the people who encounter it.
Yeah.
And it won't have the seeming of intent without an intender, because everything in it will have been intended by you in some way, maybe at some level of abstraction or remove. But it will nevertheless have all that intent that you brought to it.
Cory Doctorow, we're talking about his new book. It's called The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. We'll take another break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to a conversation with Cory Doctorow. We're talking about his new book, The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI. So right now, each generation of AI models are more expensive to train and operate than the one before. AI is getting more and more expensive to run. Every AI company is losing money. At what point are investors going to get it? That this... Surely investors aren't going to think that God is going to drop out from the sky. But it seems like right now we're in the hype cycle and they're still buying it, right?
Well, there's two famous finance aphorisms that are apropos here. So one is Stein's law that says that anything that can't go on forever eventually stops.
Yep.
But the other one is John Kenneth Galbraith, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So I don't know when the 7 companies that are 35% of the American stock market who pass the same $100 billion IOU around really fast and pretend it's in all of their bank accounts at once are going to have a reckoning. But I do know that, as accounting tricks go, that's a pretty bad one. It kind of does violence to the noble accounting fraud to call this business of just wash trading your IOU around and around and around in a circle, to call that an accounting trick. It's really cheap. And so I am quite worried, because I think when you vaporize 35% of the U.S. stock market overnight, it's going to have lots of spillover effects. Yeah. But at the same time, we've just lived through what seemed like an unstoppable bid to transfer the AI bubble to the balance sheets of everyday savers in the form of the SpaceX IPO. And it failed. The IPO hasn't happened yet, but the ability of the IPO to affect that transfer has. And it's a little in the weeds, but it's a very important thing to understand. So Elon Musk has lost a ton of money on Twitter. And in order to kind of staunch the bleeding, he started an AI company where he raised a ton of money and he sold Twitter to the AI company. It's a company called XAI, which then proceeded to lose so much money that it made the money he lost in Twitter look like nothing. But he's got this other company called SpaceX, which he sold XAI to. And SpaceX is now losing billions and billions of dollars because it is eating the losses of both Twitter and the much larger losses of XAI. And Elon Musk talked the people who run the stock indexes, the NASDAQ 100, the S&P 500, into waiving the rules for inclusion in those indexes. Now, look, if you have a retirement fund, you've probably followed the one piece of advice we've all heard, the same advice that Warren Buffett gave to his wife for how to manage their finances when he dies, which is to take it all and put it in a stock index fund. Yep. And those index funds, because they are the place where everyone who's just a normal person who's saving for retirement has put all of their money, have these very prudent, cautious, conservative rules about what goes in the index. And one of those rules is called a seasoning rule, which says that when a stock shows up in the top 100 or top 500, you don't immediately put it in the index because maybe it's just a bubble. You wait a couple of quarters. You make sure that it's got growth and it's got profit. And then when the market has figured out what its price is, then you put it in the index. Because once it's in the index, every index fund has to buy it. They are required by their defining instruments to buy a share of that stock, an amount of that stock that is commensurate with the share of the index that it comprises, which means that if Elon Musk had gotten away with including SpaceX in the index at the IPO, which I believe is happening today as we record this on June the 12th, then your fund manager, the person you gave your entire life savings to, would have immediately gone out and bought a ton of wildly overvalued SpaceX, and you would have been the liquidity, you would have been the exit capital for all of Elon Musk's billionaire buddies who fed the money furnace at XAI and gave him the money to buy Twitter when he made a joke on Twitter that turned out to be legally binding that required him to buy it. And they would have gotten away with your life savings. And so we are really getting into the desperate and sweaty end of the AI bubble for sure here.
You expect it to fail. You say that most of them will fail. Some may sort of a few hustlers, as you say, will kind of make it out. Some governments may bail out the sector, but you say it's just going to happen, that it's going to burst. And so the question, you already mentioned the terrifying possibility of the residue that the bubble is going to leave behind. But you also write about the stuff that the residue, I guess, that's useful, the stuff that will remain that's useful. And it's, you write about like transcription software that was useful to you. Image processing, you say, is going to be – that'll be good. That'll be helpful. There are going to be these translation tools and games. But I guess not, you think, developing life-extending medicines, not identifying life-saving symptoms that humans couldn't identify, not making roads and skies safer. What do you think about that?
One of the things these tools are very good at is doing multivariate analysis.
Yeah.
Mostly what we use that for right now is like figuring out, if you're Uber, you're using these tools to like figure out how little you can pay a driver and how much you can charge a rider by doing continuously adjusted multivariate analysis based on surveillance data about drivers and riders. But, multivariate analysis is the core of a lot of scientific endeavor. And if I'm right, and when the bubble pops, there's cheap GPUs and a lot of applied statisticians looking for work and open source models that have plenty of room to be optimized, then it's going to be part of our toolkit. Like I said at the start of this talk, it would be very weird to be opposed to statistical inference itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so better tools that automate multivariate analysis will make a difference. What they are not going to do is autonomously cure cancer. I mean, no one can cure cancer.
Yeah.
That's not a thing we're going to do. We're going to come up with different treatments, and we're going to come up with different ways of treating it and so on. But what they're not going to do is just autonomously cure cancer. And what they will be, the headwind they'll be tacking into is the fact that as part of the ideology that says that we're about to make God, we've just gone out and fired everyone who does cancer research, because God was going to come along and cure cancer. When you talk to the Doge weirdos about what they were doing, they were like, yeah, we understood that these government agencies did important work, but AI is around the corner. General AI, superintelligence is around the corner. So we can take these like long-running experiments where we've been following a cohort for 30 years based on interventions or lifestyle factors, where we've been, carefully tracking all this stuff. We can just incinerate it. And God will just figure it out when he arrives on the scene as soon as we get enough GPUs online. And it may be that in 30 years we look back on AI and we go, oh yeah, those tools, those multivariate analysis tools that are more available to scientists who maybe don't have to couple as tightly with the mathematicians in their department to design an analytical backend for their experimental data, or who can validate their experimental data more readily by looking at it from different angles and seeing whether the effect that they saw holds up using different analytical models. We may look back and say that was a net good, but we will say that at the start we set back cancer research by a generation, not because of anything AI does, but because we told people that God was coming, and so they fired all the cancer researchers.
Let me finally come back to your work as a science fiction writer, because you say when you're writing science fiction that it's fun to write these different crazy scenarios and experiments about the possibility of AI, but you also say that those experiments are not the same as plans. Say what you mean there.
Yeah, my friend William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace, he says cyberpunk was a warning, not a suggestion. And when we write science fiction, we are not predicting the future. we are examining the present. We are taking latent assumptions in our technology and how we organize it and challenging them. We're saying, what if we did it differently? We're not saying, what if we invent this cool new gadget? The cool new gadget is a way to get us to reassess the technology that's around us now and how we use it. And so when we do this, we always do some hand waving, because the point of this is not to produce a shovel-ready, MBA final project that you can turn into a business. Yeah. The point is to provoke speculation about how else we could arrange things. And when you ignore that there's a lot of hand waving in there, step one, invent faster than light travel. I think about this in the context of Musk and people who say that we need to become a multiplanetary society and that we should start on Mars. Adam Becker is an astrophysicist who wrote a good book last year called, I think it's called More Everything Faster or More Everything Better. He points out that if we were to set off every nuclear weapon on Earth at once, at the very same instant that the meteor that destroyed the dinosaurs hit the Earth again, that the Earth would still be infinitely more habitable than Mars would be for the next 1,000,000 years, because it would still have an atmosphere, it would still have water, it would still have oxygen. It would have a troposphere and a magnetosphere that limits the solar radiation and its ability to reach the planet's surface. So I want to send robots and maybe even scientists to Mars. I think that's an amazing idea. But the idea that we will somehow save the human race by moving it to Mars because we might do something so horrible to Earth that it becomes uninhabitable. There is nothing so horrible we could do to Earth to make it uninhabitable that would make it less habitable than Mars. So stories about space exploration are really interesting and fun and exciting and thought-provoking, but they are not a plan to save the human race from the depredation of, once again, the only planet in the universe that we know of that is capable of sustaining human life.
One thing as a science fiction writer, you say is the future's up for grabs.
Absolutely. There is an alternative. Nothing about what we will do in the future is written. It is all for us to write. And maybe I can finish by telling you the story of my wonderful friend Ada Palmer, who's a science fiction writer, but is also a tenured historian, Renaissance historian at the University of Chicago, who is beloved on campus for her end-of-year exercise where her undergraduates run a 4-week-long live-action role-playing game where they reenact the election of the Medici's Pope every year. And they spend 4 weeks wheeling and dealing, making alliances and betraying them. And then they gather in the faux Gothic cathedral at the University of Chicago. They dress up in Renaissance drag. Ada has had a Google alert for theater companies selling off their costumes forever and ever, so she dresses them all up. And they invest a pope. And every year, 2 of the final 4 have been the same. And every year, the other 2 have never been the same. And the blocks that support them have never been the same. And the outcome was never the same. Because even when you run the same historic facts from the same starting point and tell people that they have the same motivations and history and goals, you get a different outcome. Because even with those 2 people who are always in the running, who maybe are there because of the great forces of history, there is an envelope in which we operate, through which we have autonomy, in the same way that we can't do anything about the heat we've already sunk into the Earth's ocean, but we can do something about what we do with that heat when the oceans rise and when the corals bleach and when we lose our marine ecosystems. We can choose what we do about it. And of course, as we know from the problems we're having with our oceans and the story of how those 2 people ended up in the final running every time in the exercise to elect the Medici's Pope, when we say the great forces of history, we just mean the decisions that the people who came before us made. History is not an autonomous vehicle. History is something we drive. And yeah, if I pointed the car downhill, cut the brake lines, and handed you the steering wheel, there'd be limits to how you could drive it. But that wouldn't be because of the great forces of history. That'd be because I was a monster.
Cory Doctorow, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Cory Doctorow, His new book is The Reverse Centaur's Guide to Life After AI, How to Think About Artificial Intelligence Before It's Too Late. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Instagram at Radio West. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. And you can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Aidan Oneida, the program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. I'm Doug Fabrizio.